It's about time we just move on, get over apartheid and stop playing the victim. In the work that I do, I've heard the sentiment being echoed through numerous conversations whenever we discuss race and inequality in South Africa. And it is this sentiment being expressed, I think, with greater frequency in our public discourse over the past 2 decades. Other statements which usually follow the usual suspects include, I wasn't responsible for apartheid, why must I suffer for the sins of the past? Or black economic empowerment is apartheid in reverse. In the new South Africa, there are no opportunities for whites. Growing anxieties around dwindling economic prospects have been nurtured among many white South Africans and have fueled an attitude of intolerance and fatigue around retrospections of South Africa's shameful past. Attorney Asim Kadwa wrote in her 2017 op-ed in the Huffington Post in the UK, the opening line of the Constitution of South Africa. We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past. We honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land. We respect those who have worked to build and develop our country. Kadwa extrapolates from this preamble that rather than get over apartheid, it is necessary to heed the legacy that has pervaded the nation's social structures and attitudes if we intend to build a united and reconciled South Africa. Is Kadwa correct? Are the anxieties of white South Africans valid? Is it time, in fact, for black people to move on? In this video, we'll explore the history of race and inequality in South Africa, look at the socioeconomic challenges prevalent in our country today, and interrogate the facts of how these culminate to reveal an overwhelming racial inequality that for the past 26 years into our democracy has divided us and crippled our nation. South Africa has a diverse population made up of a multitude of different religions, cultures, languages, and races. To accurately engage with the discussions and stats we'll be exploring through this series, let's first take a close look at the demographics that make up South Africa's population. Out of a total population of 59.6 million people, 48.2 million people are Black African, 5.2 million people are classified as colored, which is a term we utilize for those of mixed racial and ethnic background in the South African context. 4.7 million people are white and 1.5 million people are Asian or Indian South Africans. Around 30 million or 51.2% of the population are female, while 28.8 million or 49.8% are male. South Africa is a relatively youthful country with a median age approximately 27 years. Let's first look at education. Education inequality has long been a central issue that South Africa has grappled with, and in most cases, it's held as the root or accelerator of the nation's more complex socioeconomic challenges. Prior to the dismantling of the 46-year apartheid regime, access to quality education was systematically denied to Black, colored, and Indian South Africans. In 1953, the Bantu Education Act was implemented. It was a policy targeting Black South Africans to keep them separate from and provide an inferior standard of education to that of white South Africans. The basic idea was that Black people were inherently the inferior race and thus had no business involving themselves in resolving the greater challenges of the country or involving themselves in any meaningful way except as servants to the European society. It was Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd who exclaimed that there is no place for the Bantu in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice? As an aside, I think it's just worth noting that it's fascinating that in the current political debate regarding land expropriation, that we are all now Africans, whereas then there was a particular distinction between Europeans and non-Europeans under the apartheid era, but that's a video for another day. In 1959, the Extension of University Education Act began to legally exclude Black students from attending South Africa's premier universities. The University of Cape Town, Stellenbosch University, and Witwatersrand were considered white institutions. The standard of education that Black students received began to retrogress over the subsequent decades. In 1961, for example, 90% of Black teachers had not completed their high school. To paint a simpler picture, at its height, for every one white student, the apartheid government allocated the same amount of resources to 10 Black students. By the end of apartheid, this ratio had reduced to 1 to 3.5. South Africa's current education landscape reflects that out of its total population, 68% of South Africans have attained a high school education, and a mere 12% hold a tertiary qualification. Delving deeper into these stats reveals that of their respective populations, 38% of whites, around 1.8 million, hold tertiary qualifications, followed by 21% of Asians, around 315,000 individuals, and 9% of Black Africans, equivalent to around 4.3 million. In this next segment, we'll be looking at employment and income. With an inadequate educational bedrock, finding stable employment has remained a consistent struggle for most South Africans. Official unemployment, as defined by the South African government, is the number of citizens without work but seeking employment. This definition can be expanded to include those who have become discouraged or who no longer seek employment. In 2020, the coronavirus pandemic ushered in a new depression in the job market for South Africans, seeing the loss of 2.2 million jobs between April and June. Data suggests that twice as many women have lost their jobs during the pandemic as men. Prior to the impact of the pandemic having been recorded, the official national unemployment rate sat at 28.1%. This rate was higher among females at 29.5%, while among males, unemployment was 25.3%. By the end of 2020, South Africa's unemployment rate had peaked at a record high of 32.5%. For better context on the seriousness of the situation we face, in 1933, when America faced an unemployment rate of 25%, that period was named the Great Depression. Today, unemployment is most prevalent among Black South Africans, with a rate of 33.8%, followed by colored South Africans, with a rate of 24%, Asians and Indians at 13%, and white South Africans constituting the least unemployed demographic in the country at 8.1%. Factoring in the population for each demographic further emphasizes the incredible racial disparity between the employed and the unemployed. Now let's have a look at how has this affected the quality of life of the people in our country. An examination of annual earnings reveals an astonishing racial disparity. With the lowest earnings of all race groups, Black South Africans, whose average income measures at just under 93,000 Rand per year. Colored South Africans under 173,000 Rand per year. Asian and Indian South Africans who earn around 272,000 Rand per year, while white South Africans earn an average of 444,000 Rand per year, more than 4.5 times the average earnings of any Black South African. Where families are struggling and are subject to insufficient earnings, the South African government makes provision through its distribution of various social grants. 60% of all South African households rely on these monthly social grants. Black South Africans make up the largest proportion of those receiving grants, with a rate of 33.9% of the demographic. That's around 16.3 million people. Colored South Africans follow with a rate of 29.9% or 1.5 million people. Asian and Indian South Africans at 12.5% or 187,500 people. And finally, white South Africans with a rate of 7.5% or 352,500 people. The P word is thrown around loosely in South Africa and indeed in the broader African discourse, but poverty is perhaps the single clearest benchmark by which to measure a country's immense racial inequality. The country's most impoverished demographic, by far, is Black females, with 49.2% living beneath the poverty line, while their white counterparts measure 0.4%. A similar ratio exists for men. 44.8% for Black men are impoverished, compared to just 0.4% of white men. Colored women and men have a considerable rate of poverty, measuring 23.1% and 23.6% respectively, while Asian and Indian South African women and men have poverty levels closer to those of whites with 0.9% and 1.6% respectively. Is it time to confront these glaring inequalities that are so prevalent in so many aspects of our lives as South Africans? In my opinion, doing so will necessitate confronting the legacy of our colonial and apartheid past. Yasmin Kadwa, in closing her op-ed, reflects as follows. It is up to each one of us to educate ourselves, our children, and future generations about the true nature of the atrocities of the apartheid regime. This education, as uncomfortable as it may be for some, will allow for genuine empathy and understanding among South Africans. Personally, I've come to realize and recognize that in spite of all the information that's available to us that we can be exposed to, in spite of all these stats I've shared with you on the realities of our country, it won't necessarily change our attitudes and change our feelings and change people's hearts. I'm reminded of a session I ran a few years ago where a young man came and had a conversation with me. And he said, "Dominic, I'm a young South African and I've grown up in the South African education system my whole life. From the age of 9, we've been taught about HIV and AIDS. I know exactly how HIV is contracted, I know exactly how it's managed, and I know exactly how it's prevented." A couple of months ago, however, a colleague of mine came out as HIV positive. And whenever he now makes me a cup of tea or coffee, I cannot physically bring myself to drink it. In spite of all that education, in spite of all those stats that have been shared, we need to appreciate that those will not necessarily change our hearts or to have empathy for those that are in most need within our society. But I do hope that with this video that we put together for you, we can allow our hearts to open up just a little bit more to receive that seed that may flourish in enabling us, each of us as individual, to play our part in building a prosperous and truly united South Africa.